All right. Well, welcome everyone. This is the third event in our Community Over Chaos fundraising campaign. We are the Sustainable Economies Law Center, or SELC for short. We envision a world where every person belongs in, supports, and is supported and protected by their beloved community, where cooperation and collective liberation are embedded in the social fabric of our daily lives and where empowered community life creates the bulwark against the hate, division, and extraction efforts of billionaire captured governments hostile to their people. As part of our grassroots fundraising campaign, the Law Center is hosting a month of events for movement lawyers, labor organizers, social justice organizations, law students, legal apprentices, solidarity economy practitioners, and activists who are interested in learning about ways we can resist the current chaos and build strong, self-governing communities that protect and support themselves and each other. Our solidarity partner is the Let Us Contribute initiative. So they're Lucy for short. And we are trying to raise $30,000 this month to help us further our mission, but 10% of what we raise will be forwarded to our solidarity partner, Lucy. They are a powerful example of community organizing to overcome the chaotic world around them. This particular event, and actually our entire campaign, is sponsored by these wonderful donors on the slide. And I think that's all there is. And yeah, I'm going to hand it over to Jay for your presentation. Thank you so much for agreeing to present on worker cooperative conversions.
Thank you, Tia. Hi, everyone. My name is Jay Cumberland. My pronouns are he, him. I'm an attorney at the Sustainable Economies Law Center. This presentation is called Toward Worker-Focused Worker Co-op Conversions. There's a lot of worker in there. It's an attempt by me to try to intervene and suggest a new direction for worker co-op conversions in the United States based on the experience that I've had in this area. Today's presentation has three different sections. The first section tries to ground us in to try to ground worker co-op conversions in historical context in the United States in an attempt to learn lessons from past movements. Then the second section applies that historical context to the frame that's been generated by that historical context to analyze the movement in the United States for worker co-op conversions, to evaluate it and see how it's doing. The third section suggests possible future directions based on the historical context and the analysis of what's going on right now in the United States. I will pause after each section and ask a question to help the audience reflect on that section. So you'll be able to raise your hand and we'll be able to spotlight or pin you so you can provide a response, your reflection on that particular section. I will say the first time I gave this presentation, it made a few people mad. So I think it's important if you are open to sharing sort of the position that you're coming to this presentation from. If you are a business owner, if you are a worker, if you're a attorney or a co-op developer, this presentation strikes people differently depending on the position where they're coming from. So if you're open to sharing what your relationship is to this movement, that would be great if you want to put that in the chat so people know how this presentation might be landing for different people. All right. I'll wait a second to see where people are coming from. Right. Don't see anything in the chat, so I'm going to keep moving. So the first section is situating worker co-op conversions in a historical context. I'm a person that's an attorney, but I'm also a person that values history a lot. I think that it's important that if something has happened in the past, we learn lessons from the extensive documentation of those movements in the past to see the types of questions that people have asked in prior contexts that we can ask in our present context to help us learn how to move through these complex situations that we encounter in everyday life. So the historical context that I want to situate worker co-op conversions in is the context of the abolition of slavery. Um, you might can see how somebody got mad at me. This is something that doesn't get talked about very much in 2025. What I want to say is that I believe that employment sits on a spectrum with enslavement, or as people have said in the past, that wage slavery exists on this spectrum with chattel slavery. Chattel slavery means the slavery you think of in the antebellum South, where someone owns an individual. This was a very common thing to say in the United States in the wake of the Civil War. You can see this quote on the left. It's from a really powerful and influential labor union at the time called the Knights of Labor, who were invested both in unionizing and in developing cooperatives for workers. So they were situated in this issue that we're dealing with today of co-op conversions. This is a quote from one of their journals. It says that the weight of chains, the number of stripes, the hardness of labor, and other effects of a master's cruelty may make one servitude more miserable than another, but he is a slave who serves the gentlest man in the world, as well as he who serves the worst. And he does serve him if he must obey his commands and depend upon his will. So this was in 1882. This was shortly after the Civil War in 1860. And the labor movement was saying that just as slavery had been abolished, there needed to be a movement to recognize that employment existed on a similar spectrum with slavery and needed to be abolished as well. So this was a core part of the labor movement at that time. This was not something that arose just in the context of the aftermath of the Civil War. This was something that had been spoken about before. So on the right, you can see another quote that tries to compare employment and enslavement as well, and says, the difference as compared with the old outspoken slavery is that the worker of today seems to be free because he's not sold once and for all, but rather sold piecemeal day by day, and is not the slave of a particular person, but of the whole property owning class. So this is the claim, is that these things exist on a spectrum and that we, people working on worker co-op conversion, can learn from the abolitionist movement for the abolition of slavery. What we can also see is that historically in the abolitionist movement, they understood that the methods of gaining freedom from slavery existed on a spectrum. There were certain methods of gaining freedom that were respectable to slave owners. That method that was respectable was slave self-purchase, where an enslaved person would pay for their freedom, or someone would pay to have an enslaved person freed. The comparison that I draw is that I think that worker co-op conversion in this context can be framed as employee self-purchase, where employees are paying for their own freedom. I think that's the historical analogy that helps me understand lessons from the past applied in the present. And there were lots of other ways to get free. There were slaves running away in mass and forming maroon communities. There were other ways of freedom that didn't involve going through slave owners at all, that didn't require their consent, that didn't land right to them, that they tried to prevent. Now, in the employment context, there's not just different means of gaining freedom, there's also means of negotiating more freedom without fully gaining freedom in the sense of becoming a worker in a cooperative. And the labor movement in the United States has felt that they should pursue different means for negotiating more freedom. There's a historical conflict between business unionism in the United States and class struggle unionism. Business unionism sees that the interests of labor and capital can be aligned, that agreements, collective bargaining agreements between employers and employees can represent a true sort of meeting of the minds, like a true heart to heart agreement where capital and labor align around creating better jobs or good jobs. By contrast, class struggle unionism has historically seen that the interests of labor and capital are not aligned, but are pitted against each other in a sort of war. And they don't see collective bargaining agreements as a true meeting of the minds, a true heart to heart. They see them as temporary truces in an ongoing war between capital and labor. Um, so the means of negotiating for more freedom, for better working conditions, for better wages. Some people go through business unionism methods, and some people go through class struggle methods. And in the context of the abolition of slavery, slave self-purchase was questioned intensely because abolitionists objected in principle to self-purchase, because it involved recognizing the enslaver's private property right to an enslaved person. It involved paying them in order to free an enslaved person. So, in principle, they objected, and there were extensive debates that you can learn from in the abolitionist literature about how people came around despite their principled objections to supporting slave self purchase. They ended up supporting it because of the emergency, because of the appeal of the enslaved, because of the conditions that they faced, because they only had one life, because they couldn't wait for freedom. I think the question this makes me ask is there an emergency for the employed that merits gaining freedom from the employment relationship through respectable means, through means that owners approve of, like worker co-op conversion? And the emergency of the employed is working conditions, is the ability to control their lives, the ability to take a bathroom break for your body, the ability to speak your own political opinion, the ability to control the content of your work or create a safe work environment. Um, there were also very interesting reflections that Frederick Douglass had on slave self purchase. Douglass fled to England. He's a famous abolitionist, and he wanted to come back to the United States in order to continue being a part physically in the abolitionist movement in the US. And a group of wealthy individuals that were abolitionists banded together and paid money to the former owner of Frederick Douglass to ransom him out of enslavement and allow him to return to the United States. And in the famous abolitionist magazine called The Liberator, the editor wrote a letter to Frederick Douglass and said, I can't believe that you did this. I can't believe that as an abolitionist, you let someone pay money to free you and allow you to return to the United States. You violated all of our principles. And Frederick Douglass responded and said, it would have been a violation if they paid this money because they believed that the owner should rightfully be paid it. But he said that's not what happened. He said that submission to injustice, having to pay this money, was different than sanctioning this injustice, paying the money because you believed it was right to pay that money. And he ended up calling this money that was paid a ransom. That's why it's called his ransom letter. So that is the first section of the presentation. I'll stop quickly and go off screen sharing to ask how that lands for people. What is your reaction to this comparison of enslavement and employment? Does anyone want to speak to how that lands for them in this modern context? Oh, and you can raise your hand so someone can see you and let you speak. I see one person in the chat, Darren, saying, I'm here for it. One person in the chat saying, I'm not mad. I love the framing. I'll ask a second question to see if that lands, gets any more interest from people. Do you think that you could come around to saying what this comparison suggests, which is that employment is wrong or there are no good jobs? Because it's hard to say that employment should be abolished if you think that there are, I guess, quote unquote, good jobs or good masters. Does that land as something that you could say that employment is wrong?
I see from the chat that someone said the historical context is so important.
All right, thank you, everyone. It's harder to do this on a webinar than in person where I can see your faces. um, but I will go ahead and move to the next section so we can stay on time. So I will reshare my screen. Give me one second. All right, so now that I've shared this historical context, what we learned is a framework for evaluating the current worker co-op conversion industry in the United States. We learned that in the past, enslavement and employment were seen as part of the same spectrum. We learned that people saw that some means of gaining freedom were respectable and to owners, and some means of gaining freedom were not respectable to owners. We saw that the labor movement has had some divide between negotiating freedom in a way that suggests the interests of labor and capital are aligned, and negotiating more freedom in a way that suggests they're not aligned and that any agreement is only a temporary truce. We've learned one of the core questions that abolitionists asked in order to help themselves understand whether they should support slave self-purchase, even though it violated their principles, which was, is there an emergency for the enslaved that merits supporting this, even though it violates our principles? And we've seen Frederick Douglass's analysis of the difference between sanctioning injustice in as a way of gaining freedom and submitting to injustice as a way of gaining freedom. And so I want to apply this framework to the US worker co-op conversion field and see what exists. One thing that is apparent to me is that the US worker co-op conversion industry assumes there is an alignment between labor and capital. So it fits in this traditional distinction of this traditional strategy of business unionism in a way. And it doesn't situate employment on a spectrum with enslavement as something that should be overcome, as something that should be defeated. One thing that is sort of consistent as a talking point throughout the industry is this framing that worker co-op conversion creates a win-win-win solution for the business owner who gets paid, for the workers who get to become owners and gain, freedom as self-governing employees, and for the community that gets to keep a business that might otherwise close. This is saying that these are agreements where everyone wins, where the interest of workers and owners of labor and capital are aligned around creating good jobs and valuing the work that owners have done. You can see this on the quote on the left and also on the quote on the right, which I won't read. I think that it actually goes a little bit beyond this, though, beyond just assuming that there is an alignment between labor and capital. Because there are tools that are used that suggest that conversions avoid businesses where there is not an alignment between labor and capital, but they avoid businesses where workers have a little bit more political consciousness or there is conflict between owners and employees. So I think at times, this movement proactively seeks alignment between labor and capital in order to access greater scale. One of the tools or sort of the artifacts that suggest this for me is the Democracy at Work Institute's ownership culture self-assessment tool. This is a tool that this sort of standard setting organization suggests should be used to determine whether a worker co-op conversion is a good strategy to pursue in a particular business or is not a good strategy to pursue. This quote at the top says why this tool is needed. It says that business owners often have concerns that employees don't have the cultural traits or the practices that are needed to successfully operate a business after a conversion. They say it can be difficult for owners to put a finger on what the missing elements are, and their vague concerns can be seen as unsurpassable or even as character judgments on their employees, rather than challenges to be addressed and overcome. And I think this is speaking to you know, a lack of belief, which is real, that owners have in the ability of employees to do what they're doing, even to do as a collective what owners have been doing as one person or a small team. And you can look at some of the questions that I've highlighted and see what they're getting at. They're asking, are employees loyal to the company? Do they see their interest as aligned with the interest of the company and want it to succeed? Are they willing to work extra when needed? Do they work just as hard when they're not being watched by their supervisors? Are they sort of quote unquote good employees who will go above and beyond to contribute to the business? Do they trust and have a positive relationship with managers, with ownership? It's asking, are they aligned with management? Are they aligned with ownership in this business? And if the answers are no to these, the assessment suggests it's not a good idea to pursue a conversion in this business. And I think another element of the field is that in not situating employment on a spectrum with enslavement as something to be overcome, doesn't really give a good analysis of whether workers should be paying business owners to gain their freedom. Instead, what I've seen as kind of prevalent in the field is that consultants who are primarily hired by business owners or the business will actually support owners in and recommend that owners delay a worker co-op conversion, that they delay freedom for the workers in order to allow the owner to get the value for their business that they desire. So they sanction the injustice of paying fair market value to a business owner and even help owners strategize on ways to create a stronger track record of profits that will allow them to get better financing, that will allow them to get a higher price for their business at the expense of workers sometimes. So you can see this quote at the bottom, which is about urban ore in Berkeley, California, where a worker is saying a conversion was used by the owners as a carrot, but nothing ever came of it. And the usual excuse, as the workers explained it, is that the business wasn't doing well enough to transition to a worker cooperative. This is one of those conversions where the consultant, as I understand it, recommended that the conversion be delayed until the financial records were in a better position. And the workers were upset by this. They said, we want this now. We don't want this later. Um, but generally, the way that these are advertised is to business owners. And the advertisement is that this is a win-win-win solution. The owners are allowed to obtain a fair price for their business. Um, and that's not questioned, whether the price that employees pay should be less than the price that someone else pays for a business. The question that abolitionists asked was, should we support slave self-purchase? And the answer was, well, yes, if there's an emergency for the enslaved. But I find that the worker co-op conversion movement doesn't really look at the emergency of the employed and instead looks at the an emergency for businesses, an emergency for business owners. Primarily, the framing in the field is that there is a small business closure crisis, which is a crisis for baby boomer business owners who own the majority of businesses in the United States. And it's a crisis that a lot of them can't find buyers. A lot of them will close down and not have access to the retirement that they thought their business might have provided, which is a real issue. And that some businesses will be sold to another buyer, and some businesses might be sold to a larger company or an out of area buyer. And the crisis for workers that's implied here, but not really overt, is that some of them might be laid off. They might have to deal with a new owner that they don't like as much as the existing owner. But what's frontlined is the crisis for owners here. It's not asked what is the precise nature of the crisis for employees that merits doing this when they could gain freedom in other ways. And I think what strikes me the most is the origins of the movement in the United States and the way that it desires scale, but doesn't really speak to a desire for changing the employment relationship or abolishing employment. The two foundational texts that I know of establishing this movement, which is very new, It's around since maybe 2010, maybe 2014 in the United States. So we're around 10 years of a really coherent movement in the United States, which supplanted worker co-op startup with worker co-op conversion as the primary driving strategy in the worker co-op field. And these are the two foundational texts that I think set this in course. One is an article called Worker Cooperatives Pathways to Scale. The other is an ICA group publication called Co-op Conversions at Scale. So the question that animated this field and led to it was, how do we make a lot more worker cooperatives? Which in the abstract doesn't strike me as a question that has anything wrong with it. But when you look into it, what's apparent in worker cooperatives pathways to scale is that there's an analysis of what the best method is for creating the most cooperatives. And the paper looks at an example of Argentina, where there was the International Monetary Fund imposed sort of austerity conditions, and there was a mass movement of protest in Argentina that led to factories being occupied and workers gaining control of factories. And it pairs that against other methods, like in France, where the primary driver of worker co-op scale was appealing to business owners and pushing worker co-op conversion as a strategy for retiring business owners. And what it said is that this method of appealing to owners has achieved much more scale than these other methods of political unrest or things like that. So it decided that this method should be pursued because that would allow us to achieve a lot more cooperatives. And that's proven true. I think it does create more co-ops than other methods. And the other text is this ICA group publication called Co-op Conversions at Scale. I find this text interesting because what it does is identify a market opportunity for the development of a worker co-op conversion industry in the United States. It looks to the success of the employee stock ownership plan in the United States, which was a creation in the mid 20th century to allow businesses to basically sell themselves to their employees without really having the employees buy in. If you look at the history of the 20th century in the US, you see this drastic decline in union membership. At the same time, you see this skyrocketing membership in employee stock ownership plans. And so, what this report said is that this success that employee stock ownership plans have has been unavailable for small businesses because it's too expensive to create an employee stock ownership plan for businesses between 20 employees and 100 employees. And that's where there's a niche. That's where there's an opportunity if we can create an affordable model of converting businesses that doesn't involve an employee stock ownership plan. But maybe if we create this worker co-op conversion model that is streamlined and that is efficient and that isn't cost prohibitive, we can access the success of the employee stock ownership plan for small businesses. And that's what has happened. That is the movement as it exists. But I think that desire for scale, that need to be lean, has consequences for workers. Because what I see in the models that are presented are that there is a lack of worker agency in the process of gaining freedom, in the process of a worker co-op conversion. This is another example from the Democracy at Work Institute of their model process for a worker co-op conversion. So it has all the decisions that are necessary for a worker co-op conversion listed on the left. And then the columns on the right say who gets to decide on who gets to make the final decision on those things. So if you look at the column for the selling owner, the business owner who's selling the business, they decide essentially everything. This is a model that runs through the business owner. Ultimately, they have to decide to do this. And the things that they don't decide, they get to veto. The one of the two things that the transition committee of workers gets to decide is actually vetoable by the selling owner. So the standard process requires worker buy-in. It does. And that's one of the things the ICA group identified as a challenge is that unlike the employee stock ownership plan, workers actually do have to agree to a worker co-op conversion for it to proceed. They often have to buy shares. That's not the case for the employee stock ownership plan. And so it's a sticking point. Literally, this requirement for the workers to decide was identified at the beginning as a sticking point for this model achieving scale. And one of the things that I've seen in practice is that where that sticking point is reached, where workers don't want or aren't interested in a worker co-op conversion as presented to them, what I've seen is the rise of the employee ownership trust in the United States as a way to avoid those issues of workers needing to buy in. I think this chart on the right is fairly instructive in that sense. You can see the red circles on the bottom. Do employees have to buy their shares? Is the question that's asked. In an employee stock ownership plan, they don't. In a worker co-op, they do. But in an employee ownership trust, they don't. So it solves that problem of workers having to buy in order to get an ownership interest in a business and convert it and buy out the owner. It also asks, do employees have to have a strategic role in decision making? In an employee stock ownership plan, they don't. In a worker owned co op, they do. But in an employee ownership trust, they don't. And so what I've seen is that where the workers haven't bought in and the owner still wants to sell to their employees, they get recommended to pursue an employee ownership trust to solve the challenge of worker buy-in. And so I think the market opportunity and the challenges to the market that the ICA group identified are being solved, but in a way that makes the worker co-op conversion field look a lot more like the employee stock ownership plan field in the United States. There we go. I know my perspective is very negative. So does anyone have any stories to share that they think highlight a different element of the field that my overly negative portrait misses?
Jay, can you repeat that question again?
Does anyone have stories to share? I guess I'll expand it. Does anyone have stories to share of whether this resonates with them as something they've seen in the field? You've seen these issues, or does anyone have stories that say the opposite? That you want to tell stories that show a positive aspect that I'm overlooking?
All right, I promoted Darren and Elizabeth to panelists so they can share some stories.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great, thanks. Super intriguing perspective and discussion. My mind is reeling. I probably shouldn't have had coffee right before this webinar, but there's so many things going on. One of the things that came up for me is kind of your take on the business closure crisis. I worked with the Minnesota Center for Employee Ownership, so we were talking about that a lot. And the take that I have on it is slightly different than yours, is that it's not necessarily a crisis for owners and businesses, but we focused more on the community in general, and this especially in um, smaller towns, more rural communities where there might be only one or two good source of income for people. And so we're really trying to push employee ownership as a focus for preserving, you know, decent jobs and, you know, goods and services and the community in general. So really trying to focus on that. And I see where your perspective on the triple win um, and your take on that has a lot of valid points in what it and how it can slant the perspective of the deal. But I think that really focusing on the community kind of changes the narrative a little bit in that you're really trying to support kind of these smaller communities through a transition strategy and a more of a longer term struggle for building solid foundations in those communities.
Thank you for that perspective there and rounding out the crisis. What I focused on was the crisis for owners and businesses, but the community point I overlooked. Thank you. Elizabeth or David?
Sure. Was there somebody else before me though? I don't want to jump
Go
in.
ahead, Dave. Go ahead, Dave.
Okay, great. Yeah. Hey Jay, good to see you. It's really hard to do something like this in 35 minutes or so. So thanks for presenting a really interesting perspective. And I know part of the nuance of things can't really get into too much. So, but your question, I guess partly I would say I think there's more nuance to maybe the way you kind of explain things and lay things out. But of course there would be. But I have seen in what partly brought me to employee ownership was multiple businesses that were closing because there was not a viable way for the owner to stay involved, and they were leaving, they were retiring, and so they just wrapped up the business, and there weren't opportunities for the employees to kind of keep the business going because they might not have had access to the resources to be able to buy all the equipment or things like that. And so I've seen some of the benefits of employee ownership conversions is that it allows employees that probably couldn't go out start the same business or bring their skills or even have their history of legacy businesses already built up. Startup work is hard. And so I've seen some benefits there.
Thank you, David. Yeah, you're sort of echoing some of what Darren said, and that it can be a crisis for the community of losing businesses, and this is a way to keep them. And yes, there's a lot of nuance that I'm missing in trying to condense this into a small session. And you're right that one of the problems is that startups are hard. That if workers do want to go out and start a startup business, it has a lot of risk and risk that taking over an existing business doesn't. So that's something for workers to consider, definitely too. I think I should move on to make sure we close by 2, Elizabeth, if that is okay.
That's good.
I
You
will,
go.
I will. So in light of this, what would it look like to apply this framework to try to intervene and suggest new directions for the worker co-op conversion movement in the US? I think first, it's still true that workers deserve freedom and they can make choices about how they want to pursue that, whether they want to pursue that through respectable means like a worker co-op conversion, or whether they want to pursue that through means that owners wouldn't love, like exiting and forming their own co-op when that's possible, which it isn't always, like David said. Whether they want to pursue sort of critical strategies like factory occupation, like one of the co-ops that sort of inspired in a way the movement in the US, which was New Era Windows in the United States. Workers still deserve that, and they can make those choices, and the movement can evaluate them. But what I think needs to be said also is that self-purchase or even purchase by someone else is a political dead end in the grand scheme of things, if we're drawing this comparison. Compensated manumission basically means a state, like in this case on the left, the District of Columbia during the Civil War, where Abraham Lincoln paid all slave owners to free their slaves, $9,000 a person in current US dollars. And if the desire is the end of employment, it's never going to be possible to raise an amount of capital that would allow all businesses in the US to be compensated for the freedom of their employees. There are hard built-in limits to what's possible with this model, which is why when chattel slavery was abolished, that was not how it was done, except in a few isolated incidents, sort of as a political statement, like with Abraham Lincoln here, or where it was forced to be done, like the country of France demanding that Haiti pay all enslavers for the value of their slaves who gained freedom through political revolt. So there doesn't have to be a relationship necessarily between something that might make sense for individual workers, for individual businesses, and a big picture political scheme of scale, of changing employment relationships. And for me, what this means in my practice and how I advise is that it's okay for promoting worker agency, for promoting critical reflection by workers to mean that fewer conversions happen. This is part of, for me, that it's hard once it's hard negotiating for workers that have this perspective. It's hard for an employee to speak their mind, or a group of employees to speak their mind and say they think that part of the purchase price they're paying is a ransom. If they say that to a business owner, the conversion doesn't normally go very well. It's also hard for workers that have this perspective to negotiate. If negotiating means they don't really say what they feel because they want the purchase to succeed, it makes it much more complicated. If owners and workers have a different language to describe what they think the conversion means. And for me, in advising worker groups, it means giving them choice, letting them have a political analysis, letting them apply it. And maybe that means for them that what's most important for them is declining a conversion, is saying they don't want it, even if it's offered to them as a good choice. That's okay for them to do, even if it means fewer conversions, even if it means fewer worker costs. It's okay to encourage them to unionize before a conversion, to establish better wages for themselves, better working conditions, and see, after they've done that, do they still want to go forward with a conversion? If they've been able to win their rights without paying an owner for their freedom, do they still want more? Or do they want to unionize instead of converting? That's fine too. It also means helping them negotiate using their own language. Negotiate speaking to past conflicts with management or past conflicts with owners, even if it means the conversion is less likely to succeed. Because maybe what they want is to be able to speak their mind in a way that they've never been able to do, even if it means the conversion doesn't succeed. It also means, where possible, helping employees consider alternatives, like exiting a business and forming their own co-op, especially in industries that don't take a lot of capital to form a business in. That helps them negotiate more, or from a better bargaining position. And I think it's okay if it means there's more progress towards the abolition of employment. I think these things are not necessarily related. Scaling co-ops through co-op conversions doesn't necessarily have any relationship, to me, towards ending employment. There's lots of movements that speak to scale. The two foundational docs that I shared speak to a desire to achieve scale in the industry. There's other movements like the 50 by 50 initiative that aims to have 50 million employee owners in the US by 2050. But even that is a scale that is limited. It's not saying that employment is wrong, that this institution needs to be abolished. It's just saying we need to have a lot more co-ops. And for me, as someone who tries to apply this framework in my practice, it means that the things that we might be measuring in this field might look a little bit different. It might look like trying to find ways to measure the agency that workers feel, or what they gain through the process of considering a conversion that they might decline, that they might reject, how their political consciousness is developing through the advice that's being given to them, which pushes forward towards the abolition of employment. And I also think it means that someone else has to take the lead on intervening in this industry, because right now, what this industry primarily looks like is consultants who appeal in their language to business owners as the people that have to make the decisions to move these conversions forward primarily. They represent owners, and yet they also claim to represent the interest of workers. The industry moves in a way by believing that there is alignment of labor and capital, because otherwise it wouldn't be possible to claim to represent the interest of everyone in a particular deal. And so I don't think the people that are leading this industry are really positioned to change it. And I don't have answers. I do think that working with labor, um, finding a way for labor consultants to be involved, to give workers an alternative to support their agency, to support their PR and comms on this industry would be helpful. But I also recognize that that probably means a lot fewer conversions. So maybe it just needs it means that the industry needs to reframe itself around a different goal, because I don't necessarily know a way to support an industry of conversion from the worker side, because it's not always what's best for them or what they want. Um, I don't know. That's what I have. I'm still seeking the answer, still in conversation. That's all I've got. I wanted to just, yeah, ask a question for the audience. We have a little more time now. Of how do you think the industry should change, and who do you think should be a player in that, in helping it move in different directions? Yes, Elizabeth, I think you're already on the panel, so you can unmute.
Yeah, thanks. Um, yeah, I think just one of the things I'd like the industry or as a whole, or anyone just talking about conversions is that worker co-op conversion may or may not be a good thing for the workers, depending on a lot of things, but often depending on what price they're paying to buy the business and whether the business owner recognizes at all how much wealth the employees, especially the long-term employees, over time have contributed to the business. So just because the employees are going to own a business, like business ownership is not, at any cost is not always a good thing. And it's not necessarily in the interest of the workers. If the business owner has a price for which they're willing to sell the business, it may not be a price that anyone, including the workers, want to pay. So this notion that one attorney can represent the interest of both the workers and the owners, when that interest in most business deals are represented by two different lawyers because they're most of the time conflicting. Like the owner wants the most money they can get, and the person buying the business wants it for the least amount of money they can get. It doesn't occur to me that those interests are aligned enough for one attorney to represent both interests on the sale of the business, which is essentially what it is. So check. Thanks.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, and I'll say for what it's worth, I think it's really, I think it's really hard to talk about fair market value or what an alternative to it would look like in any, and come up with any concrete number. And that's something that I think work needs to be done on. Is this is not the same as the abolition of enslavement. It is the case that many owners work without pay to start up a business, and I think it's questions of, have they been compensated for that or not? And yeah, to what extent have the workers contributed to the value of the business, and what extent have the owners? And it's really complicated. And so I don't, it's hard to get into the nuance of it, but it's necessary, I think. I'll pass it over to you, Darren.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree with what Elizabeth was saying. That is wrong for to have one attorney represent both sides. That just doesn't make sense to me. I think it's really important that the workers in a transaction have proper representation for their interests, and making sure that they also have that a developer comes in or a support person comes in at a time early enough in the process to be able to level that playing field between the workers and the owners. And really, one other thing is that another part of that is the valuation process, and that definitely can't be just owner driven. It has to be taken from a couple different perspectives and negotiated between those two perspectives. Because if you're just taking a valuation from an owner always thinks their business is worth, twice more than it actually is, and they always want to cash out with their million or $5 million or whatever that is. Whereas, you know, taking it from a worker's perspective, it should be primarily about inventory that can be passed along, as well as potential revenue into the future. And depending on the business, that might be based more on um, actual sales versus labor, depending on what the mix is. So I think that's a small part, but on the grander scale, I'm really intrigued about the conception of abolishment of employment as a form of abolishment of slavery, and really trying to figure out how that fits into what I do in the future. And that's going to take some time for me to chew on mentally.
Thank you so much for that reflection, Jared. Yeah, it takes a lot of time to chew on that. I know we've got 2 minutes, so I think I will pass it over to, who do I pass it to? Tia, do you close us out? And I'll share the ending slides.
Sure. Let's see your ending slides. All right. So just to let you know again, this is our third event in our Community Over Chaos fundraising campaign. And we have 2 more events or 2 more MCLEs coming up. Please check out the calendar. We're trying to raise $30,000 from our supporters in our community. 10% of what we raise will go to the Let Us Contribute initiative. And yeah, so we have 2 more MCLE events and 1 big party in Oakland next week. So we hope you can make it. Thank y'all so much for coming, and for all the attendees who, contributed to the conversation. You made it so much more lively. And thank you, Jay, and the interpreters. See y'all next time.
Thank you so much, everyone.